Dear participants, let me introduce you our distinguished speaker for tonight. We are moving from Asia to Latin America. And as you can imagine, probably you dreamed about the logic of finishing Asia, then Latin America, then Middle East, but the world is so jumping in all the events happening. So we decided also not to make your life easy and to have each week absolutely new region. And we are very happy that Dr. Horacio Saavedra had this time that early morning for Mexico. And I will briefly introduce him because I have a pleasure to know him, but I not to remember how many years, but something like 25 years. So I saw his growth from the master student to one of the most well-known Mexican experts and diplomats. And why it is the pleasure that he agreed to deliver the lecture about that huge region of Latin America and Caribbean, because he has the unique composition of three backgrounds. So, as you can imagine, being Dr. Horacio, he had his PhD from the University of Tübingen in Germany in political sciences. So he's the specialist in the international relations. He's been at the diplomatic service of Mexico for a number of years. He was the Consul General of Mexico in Miami and Consul General of Mexico in Frankfurt, from two sides of the Atlantic. And also he worked as the speechwriter for the governor of the state of Mexico, who later became the president of Mexico. He worked for the other governmental positions. And now he returned back to the expert community, specializing in quite a big regions of Europe and the United States, Latin America, being the member of the Mexican Council on Foreign Relations, or you may know them as COMEXI, and that is the good partners of Ukraine and Ukrainian Prism. We just signed the memorandum being there, and we are really happy to continue this cooperation and to have Horacio with us today. The procedure is usually you have the lecture, you saw that we will have the presentation, and then be ready with all your questions, either typing them in our chat or just delivering them here. With this and your respect, Horacio, the floor is yours, and our bright Ukrainian young experts are in your hands now.
Hi, thank you so much, Hannah. Well, nice to see you. We have a sunny day in Mexico. I hope you could be here. And we're close to the mountains in Mexico City. As everybody thinks about Mexico regarding our beaches or deserts, but we are full of mountains, and especially in Mexico City, close to the volcanoes. So we have this close relation, and I have it with Europe, and especially with Ukraine since some decades, as Hannah mentioned. And it is very interesting what we see from here, because Ukraine is too far, and we face different problems in the discussion, especially now talking about the war in Ukraine and our views of Eastern Europe, and especially Russia and Ukraine. Is too far, and we are still talking about old paradigms. We're still thinking about Europe as a colonist continent. We're still thinking about the U.S. Regarding many interventions that we have and we had in many Latin American countries. And when we go to the specific issues, and especially about Ukraine, we don't have many information. It's too far from us, and we face that problem when we discuss in any country. And I don't know why, but that's always happened in Europe. That many Europeans, they want to begin any discussion in Brazil. What I think is a kind of natural, because this is a big country, populated. Is maybe they identify it more as a South American country. Mexico is more in the north. But first, everybody wants to talk and discuss any issue and any political issue in Brazil. So, and I think for the case of Ukraine, that's not so convenient. Why? Because you have an impression that is not the general impression or the general idea that you should have about Latin American positions regarding Ukraine and this specific conflict that we have now. Not only about peace, but also about economics, and especially about ideology and politics. If you ask me, what would you suggest? Of course, Mexico, but no, I would say my first visit to, if I could be Ukrainian, my first visit to Latin America could be maybe Colombia. It's in the middle. Yeah, but everybody's thinking, no, no, we go to Brazil, we go to Chile or to Mexico. Okay, that's fine. But I would suggest, for example, in my first impression would be better if I could go to Colombia, because Colombia is, let's say, in the political map, is not so compromised with the U.S. like Mexico, and is not so influenced by China like Brazil, and also is not so ideological like Chile, or so polarized like Argentina. Argentina has always this, like the last pope is a country that likes polarization. You see that in Argentina. So my first suggestion would be Colombia, for example. But well, anyway, we had these experiences discussing the future of Ukraine, for sure a peaceful solution. Uh, and what we face, for example, in the case of Brazil when we were there, is that, like in Mexico, Brazilians do not doesn't know so much about the history of recent Ukraine. Uh, Maybe they remember Gorbachev, but they don't know if he's Russian or he's Ukrainian, and that's the recent history that we know in Latin America in general. Of course, if you go to the specialists, they know everything, no? But we had this experience, for example, with some business people in Brazil. And on the other hand, China is very present, and they have a strong political connections with Russia through the BRICS. So I remember what some ambassador said in Brasilia. It was the ambassador of the European Unions. You have to understand Brazilians. They see this conflict as a problem between brothers. They are not going to take positions. It's not interesting for them. And the people defending the Ukrainian position and Ukrainian arguments, they were the Europeans, and especially the European Union. And the other Latin Americans, they were, well, discussing uh, um, what's happening in every country regarding the political spectrum, which is now, let's say, more left oriented. But actually, nobody knows about what's happening in Ukraine, even in the government level. So, so in that sense, what I think is in every country, in Mexico, but we saw it in Brazil. You have to introduce, or you have to refresh the history, to refresh what is Ukraine, to refresh what is Russia now, to refresh um, what is the world, because they don't know, and we don't know in Latin America in general. So Hannah is very gentle, saying I'm an expert. Well, maybe in some things, migration, geopolitics, not in PowerPoint presentations. And let me see if I can do it well. So let me see what can I do, because here I am trying to open that. Okay, now, so how can I share that, Hannah? You see the presentation, no?
Anna, you're muted.
Yes.
Are
Not
you
now.
watching?
We saw it before.
Uh-huh. So you
Just
don't.
choose share again.
Okay. Okay. Let me go here for a second, and I can go direct to the presentation. I have it here. Let me. Okay. Share. Okay. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
So you're watching the
Yes.
presentation now.
Now we have it.
So, uh, yes, and we want to have a positive perspective of this dialogue, and I would have some recommendations, but I want to describe a bit the problem. Uh, so, Latin American countries have responded to the Russian and Ukrainian conflict following two main approaches. Most Latin American states have support to Ukraine using non-intervention and self-determination principles. Uh, so we developed this doctrine in Latin America because of our history. We we were European colonies, and but especially during the 19th century, most every European country invade Latin America. No, in Mexico we have close to here a museum of interventions. So because we had the French intervention, we had the many American interventions, British interventions. Uh, well, not Ukrainian intervention, which is a positive thing, but most every European Western country was in Mexico in an invasion, no? Uh, and it's also the case in many other different countries in Latin America. So, and when we hear intervention, for us is, let's say, a negative political experience. And self-determination principles also have to do with the influence, especially of the United States, uh, regarding what kind of government we should have, because in different periods of time, the U.S. used the argument of democracy to have influence or, let's say, put some regimes or governments close to the U.S. view in many Latin American countries. So we developed this concept of self-determination. And when we think in, for example, in Ukraine, we say Ukraine has the right uh, to use international law to reject foreign intervention and to have self-determination. No, it's a civic issue. You discuss it in the diplomatic level, but also, let's say, the people general Mexicans understand that, and it's like that almost everywhere in Latin America about these two uh, principles. And Brazil and Mexico share these both approaches. You see in the diplomatic school in Itamaraty that they use these two principles. But if you talk to a Brazilian, this person can say also, yes, I understand intervention and I understand self-determination, even if those are um, political concepts. And Brazilian and Mexican representatives in the United Nations have criticized many Russian actions, and they use these arguments. And you can see also that various Latin American countries argue that Russia is responding to the expansion of NATO and Western imperialism. And then what happened there? Yeah, no, we are talking about international law, and we are talking about to defend the right of self-determination, the borders. We're defending the borders. We're defending the territory. But many Latin Americans, including Mexico, uh, uh, see NATO as an imperialist uh, institution. So let's go ahead and let me explain that. There's also Latin American reticence of imposing economic measures against Russia. Latin American policymakers do not support sending military equipment to support Ukraine. Latin America use multilateralism and international law as a way to criticize US imperialism, and that has to do with the argument of NATO. And on the other hand, we have countries like Bolivia, Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela that are evasive to criticize Russia because of their close political ties. No. Okay. So let's let's begin with a map. Uh, Also, something very strange for me, but is very common in the universities and the academic world, is you have specialists on Latin America and North America. Okay, so we have two different maps, but if you for example, in the case of Berlin, I was in my last. I wrote my PhD in, I studied my PhD in Tübingen in the south, but I went the last year to Berlin to the Free University, and they have two institutes, North America JFK Institute and Latin America Institute. And in the North America, they discuss about the future and they discuss about the JFK and Obama. And you go to the Latin American Institute and they discuss about the Mayas and the pyramids. That's very unique, let's say, talking about as a Mexican, no? Okay, and I want to discuss a Mexican current issue, we are very close to the US is our main trading partner. We have many millions of Mexicans living there, uh, many Mexican immigrants, but also uh, more than 30 millions that have been there for several generations. So, how can I discuss Mexico and the relations of Mexico and the world and also the US if I am talking only about the pyramids and the Mayas? Or how can I discuss North America if I don't speak about Mexico or the rest of Latin American countries? So we have this problem in the universities, and you see that problem also here in this map and in the discussion because you want to discuss Ukraine and you go to Latin America without discussing it, for example, in let me see, I have here okay, a laser, yes, uh, Florida. Florida is key for any Latin American discussions. The media, the most important media in Spanish is in Miami. The Latin American politicians, they met in Miami. Now Trump is in Miami and in Palm Beach. Marco Rubio, let's say a friend of mine or somebody that I know, is always in Florida. And I saw Mario in Miami often, no? So you want to discuss Latin American politics and you don't go to Florida, or you want to discuss Mexican politics and you don't go to the U.S. or to Canada. So you have to understand that diversity and this differentiation, talking about demographics, politics, and culture. For example, the Mexicans, we consider ourselves are not Americans, but we are very proud of being Latin Americans in culture. And we speak Spanish, for sure. Yeah, and Argentinians, if you go to the Argentinians, they like to be South Americans, but they are not especially proud of being South Americans. They don't say that too much. uh, and they consider themselves as Europeans in many senses, and it's a matter of identity, no? Uh, and we have another very different example, which is Bolivia, where half of the population is indigenous people, and they are proud of that. Uh, and they don't consider themselves Europeans, and they are not too close to the US. So it's let's say very different example, and they have Trotsky movements with let's say a Soviet inspired ideology. So let's go over there. Uh, in the Americas, what is Americas? You have to understand that concept if you want to uh, uh, go ahead to the what's happening here in the continent. The Americas is, let's say, a concept that includes North America, Latin American, but it's easy because you can use it for many issues, for migration. You can use it for religion. You can use it for politics. Um, and you don't have to do that division, which is Latin America and North America, no? Or you don't have to talk anymore about this idea of the white United States and the non-white Latin American. And well, let's see some figures. Spanish speakers in the Americas, we have about 400 million. Many of those Spanish speakers in the U.S. And we have, for example, in Toronto, 1,200,000 Mexicans speaking Spanish just in Toronto. So you can say that Toronto is a Latin American country, a Latin American city. Yeah. And by the way, Vancouver was Mexican at the beginning when we at the independence. Vancouver was Mexican, just some years, but it's just another point to illustrate how complicated is the continent, and the best way to approach the discussion, not just thinking about Latin American and North America. So, most of the continent is Christian, very Catholic in some countries. And who is here? We have here Bolivar. And Bolivar explains many of these feelings that we have in Latin America regarding Europe. We have an admiration to Europe, but also a sense of anti-colonialism. As I said, most of Latin American countries and North America gained the independence from European powers, and we have this idea that the Western world is thinking in taking the resources and the power in Latin America. No? Now, here we have something that I want to explain to you that is very important for the Ukrainian discussion in the continent, and especially in some countries like Brazil, Mexico, and the case of Bolivia and Argentina. We have this idealism of different historical moments, and I think that's the reason of the Soviet soft power now in Latin America, even when Russia has not really an important uh, political resources in the continent or economic resources. Um, this painting is by Frida Kahlo. Um, and in Mexico, we have this idea that Trotsky was uh, um, very important in world history, but I think it's now like Frida or like Che Guevara, a Mexican character, a Latin American character. For many Latin American countries, the Russian Revolution is a positive paradigm. Some Latin Americans saw the Soviet Union as a model for revolution and anti-imperialism, and Leo Trotsky became an ideal for some intellectuals and political movements. Uh, and we have, let's say, a material example when the USSR endorsed Cuba against US intervention. Everybody admired the USSR because it was supporting the independence of Cuba, no? And we have now a real political factor, which is that in the 1968 movements, many students have these Soviet ideals in Latin America, but now these students, professors, or the people in movement in the movement, they are very old, but they have the new generations, and some of the sons of, let's say, the sons of the 1968 are now in the power. For example, the lady president of Mexico, Claudia Sheinbaum, is the daughter of the activist of the 1968 movement. So uh, she had, let's say, a life admiring Trotsky or admiring the Soviet ideals. And now we have in many Latin American countries, we have these sons of the 68 in power positions. Also, it's the case of Brazil, but also in Colombia, you saw it in Argentina, in many countries, in Ecuador, in Peru, uh, everywhere, also in Central America. Uh, these people that they were the sons and the daughters of the 68 activists. They are now having a real political influence. Even when they don't really experience what happened in the Cold War or what happened in the real Soviet experience. And we have these prejudices. Well, this is, let's say, a very admired prejudice in Mexico. Maybe everybody knows Mila Jovovich in Mexico, and they think in Ukraine. But that's it. We when you want to discuss about the what is the difference between the Ukrainians and Russians, we really don't know, and it's like that in Ecuador or in the Caribbean or in Costa Rica. We really don't have the recent experience, and we don't have the information. It's still a matter for the specialist. And what I mentioned also that for some of Latin Americans, the conflict in Ukraine and Russia is a problem between brothers. So we don't have to go and help them. Let's them discuss their family matters, no? I want to discuss what is now very important, talking about national interest for many Latin American countries, trading partners. You can see here how was Latin America in 2000. The main partner was everywhere the US, but now the reality is different. So this red is the Chinese economic presence. And you can see that for many of those countries, now it's more convenient to have a good relation with China. So, and I think that also happened in the discussion in Latin America. Then that the Ukrainians think that their problem is Russia. No, Russia is not really influential in Latin America. The problem is China. You can see. You have to deal with China. Everything in those countries has something we do with China, and it was not like that in the past. You can see also in that map, and we have this European Union prediction that China is going to be even more important by 2035. And we see a Chinese hard power in Latin America and also the soft power. We saw the soft power recently in the COVID pandemic and the vaccines, and Russia appeared that. And let's say it was something not normal anymore to see Russian soft power in that level since the 80s maybe, no. So well, trading partners, and you can see Russia is important, maybe here from Brazil for BRICS. But for Argentina, Russia is not important in trade, not relevant, and nor for Mexico. And well, I'm talking about the numbers. Is the same thing, no? Russia is not really influential in economics, but I would say in this Soviet soft power that is still there. And now with the BRICS, it plays a new role because it comes with the, well, you know that with the whole group, no? If China is there, India, well, Russia is not so relevant in numbers, but is still there and is in the group and very close to Brazil. And well, that's very interesting that, as I mentioned, that now China has more presence in many Latin American countries than the US. But also, I think the big loser in Latin America is the European Union. European Union used to be very influential in Latin America, and it is not anymore. Now, we want to have some we want to have effective discussions in Latin American countries. What can we do? What can we do? Well, as I explained, we have to refresh the history. This very important to talk about the new Ukraine, the democratic transitions. Uh, Also, it's not very uh, common in Europe now because nobody wants to talk about religion and politics and at the same time. But they do it very let's say everyday basis in the US. It's very common to discuss religion and discuss politics. And I think is an option. If you begin saying that on talking about uh, Ukraine as a European country, but also as a country with Christian history, you have friends in Latin America and also in the US. In the US, the church and the different churches are very influential, and 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 maybe you have more influence going to the churches than going to some politicians in the case of the US. Now we have to discuss the relevance of Ukraine. Talking about geopolitics, we have a very good experience in Brazil because they understood that when we talk about agriculture and when we see the numbers um, regarding minerals and other strategic materials in Ukraine, Ukraine is attractive and is not the same. Let's say, narrative. Where, of course, it's important to talk about the human rights, to talk about the war, but they want to hear more about the country, not just what's happening in United Nations. I think would be familiar to talk about the which is common in both regions. For example, the borders. We have to respect the borders. It's a Latin American value, and you use this value about the respect of the borders. They understand it immediately. Uh, and also, I don't know why, but you don't want to discuss about migration. You have many millions of Ukrainians abroad, and the impact is extremely important, and you don't talk about it. And it's a very, very sensitive issue in Latin America. And one recommendation, well, don't talk too much about NATO because for different reasons, NATO is considered a Western imperialist organization. So don't begin with that. It's not productive to talk too much about NATO in Latin America and not very productive nor now in the US. You lose time. So welcome to Latin America and welcome to the Americas. Thank you.
Thank you, Horacio. Now turning back to the conversation that we can have. Uh, Definitely, we're speaking about the huge continent with the too many countries, so it's impossible to feed politics for each of the country here. And for us, it's more important to understand the main trends that we should follow to understand the logic behind the actions of Latin America. But let me ask you while our participants are thinking about what questions they may have, so feel free as usually to raise your hands. If we will ask you, what are the three main trends we need to follow the next, let's say, 2 years in Latin America?
Mhm.
What would you stress for us?
Well, I think the general trend, and it's a positive one, is that the most Latin American countries, and also in the US and Canada and the Caribbean, everybody is discussing a peaceful solution. I think that's positive. That's one trend. And this trend is present and very present in the United Nations. Well, the second trend is, now that we have fortunately more information, and we are thinking in Ukraine more as a victim as an interesting country that has strategic attractiveness and strategic relevance. And now we are thinking in doing business in Ukraine, and we are leaving behind the ideological, uh, let's say, romanticism that we have, no? And the third trend in Latin America, I could say, is now that many countries are having specific positions by topic. Let's say if we are talking about the war, about the peace, we have one specific position. If we are talking about NATO, we have a specific position. For example, we don't want to discuss that in Latin America, no? Talking about that. But talking about trade, we have a specific position. And for example, that position could be that it's convenient, the peace, because everybody wants to can do business there. And Latin America has a participation, or talking about humanitarian issues. International law is a priority, and we are going to be very firm on that. And in every issue now we are having this discussion in Latin America. Well, what I think is positive, because at the beginning it was very general. It was like you are in favor or against Zelensky, and now that is changing. I would say that could be my three new uh, perspectives in the Latin American discussion.
Thank you. Do we have questions already from the room? So while feel free just to raise your hand so I can see who is the next, or just switch on your microphone if you don't see any hands yet over here. So let me continue with the questions. We understand the Brazilian role at the international arena because of the participation in BRICS. So partially, Brazil is seen as one of those big tigers that potentially can influence the regions. Is Brazil seen in the same way in Latin America? If we are speaking not only about the position regarding Ukraine, but in general influencing the foreign policy of the different countries in Latin and America and Caribbean. So, or better say, do you see them as part of the continent, as outsider because they are Portuguese speaking, so with a little bit different legacy, or they are really, because of their size, are the most influential country among the Latin American?
So yeah, well, I think many Latin Americans see us as a big neighbor and as a huge neighbor. It's not the case of Mexico, because Mexico is so far, and we have a bigger neighbor, which is the U.S. But in the case of many Latin American countries, they'll see it as a different player. And in the case of Argentina, I think it's ambivalent, because sometimes they are very close partners. Sometimes they compete, or it was in the past. Now the relevance of Brazil is clear, but in the past they used to compete. Who was the most relevant player in South America, Brazil or Argentina? And in Mexico, we never consider ourselves South American, so we don't play that game, no. Now the new player is China, And I think many Latin American countries are thinking more now in China than in Brazil. And this is the case also from the case of Argentina. Uh, we have to understand that the strategic, let's say, the most strategic plan maybe is not the most evident, because if you think like that, we don't have the results that we want. As I mentioned, you think that okay, the bigger South American country is Brazil, that's why we go there. No, 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 no. Maybe the bigger animal in the zoo is a bull, or in the farm is a bull, but you don't go with the bull. That's why my recommendation would be not to go to Brazil, because you have the Russian presence, or the Russian political alliance. You have a very strong Chinese role. You have now a left government that is remembering Trotsky and the Soviet idealism. I wouldn't recommend to go there, even if it's important. That's what I think is different to see which is relevant and which is productive. Of course, we have to consider you have to consider Mexico also, and in the case of Mexico, it was very confusing to discuss the issue of uh, Ukraine, because most of the people think that Zelensky was with the Democrats and Trump was with Putin, and this is very simplistic. It's not like that. So, and if you come to discuss to Mexico, even in Mexico, it's also a big country. You have these also these problems in the table. So I think yes, Brazil is still relevant, but I think now the relevance in Latin America is China, and also is the the actor that is concerning the U.S. They don't the U.S. is not concerned about Brazil at all. It's concerned about China.
Daria?
Yeah, thank you so much, Horacio, for your wonderful lecture, because I actually have had some insights, and I just had an opportunity to look at some issues from a different standpoint. So thank you so much. And I have a question. This is obviously about the Russian resentment. So the question is, how can we address this complex dynamics of Russian resentment in conversations with Latin American partners? I know this must be individual for every different country. However, probably you can draw some trends. So many of the countries, as you said, may view Russia's action in Ukraine through the lens of anti-Western, uh, anti-Western sentiment, particularly in light of the desire of recognition of diverse identities, as seen in both Latin Americans and Ukrainian context. Because we, as Ukrainians, we want our identity to be recognized as separate and unique, as many countries, like all the countries and identities in the Latin American one, they also have a desire to be recognized as unique. So how should we navigate these discussions about Soviet cultural diplomacy, let's name it like that, and the current geopolitical climate, considering the perspectives of influential scholars and ideas that are widespread. For example, the Argentinian scholar Walter Mignolo, who view Russia's aggression as it like defense against the collective West and collective Western ideology. So based on all this context, could you please draw some, I know, strategies for us to navigate the conversations like that with our partners? Thank you.
Yes, no. I think we need an strategy. You're very clever. Yeah. I agree with that. We need a strategy. So we're talking about this idealism. The first thing that you can say, let's say, to break the ice. Well, yes. You have this tie to the Soviet history, and by the way, you can say, for example, Trotsky was born in Ukraine, no? You can say, and then you break the ideas that is Russia against Ukraine, no? Well, uh, and don't touch, let's say, which is very sensitive in Latin America, and that's the case of NATO. Maybe you can begin with European Union. What do you think about Ukraine being part of the European Union? And I could say most of the Latin Americans and also in the US, they would agree. No, I agree. You are Europeans, you are neighbors. Yeah, I find that positive. Trade is good for everybody. Maybe Russia is not so aggressive regarding that in comparison to NATO. Yes, yes, we can discuss Ukraine being part of the European Union. So that kind of discussions. Avoid the discussions where you know that many Latin Americans have some prejudices or some clear political preferences.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Anna.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the lecture and insights as well. I am curious about the mentioning of migration actually in your speech. I was wondering, what do you mean by this common challenge between Ukraine and Latin America, Mexico in particular? Do you mean the issue of kind of outflow of people uh, outside of the Ukraine, or do you mean, no, I mean like the number of refugees we have right now worldwide as a country in a state of war, or do you mean the inflow of people of different cultures to Ukraine or Latin America?
Yeah, well, I think it's a very easy way to share a common experience, the migration phenomena, because they are families, they are people moving, they are is you are talking about persons, you are talking about a little girl, you are talking about a daughter, about a mother. So this discussion is very productive and also has many other agendas that are tied. For example, economic agenda, demographic agenda, political agenda. And what I see is that in general, the Ukrainian migration has been very welcome almost everywhere, which is not the case of the Latin American migrants. At the beginning, for example, the Cubans were very welcome in the U.S. and the Venezuelans. Now, not anymore the Venezuelans. But in general, the experience in Latin America is very hard talking about migration. So if you share what happened to those, for example, those Ukrainian families that left everything behind, their jobs, their houses, their families, and now in another country alone with their culture, with their values, but alone, and beginning again, the experience of beginning from nothing, no? If you share those experiences in discussions or even in art, it's very easy for art, for example. You can use this discussion to have a close tie with many Latin American countries. Because if you begin talking about democracy, you are losing your time. In Latin America, democracy is identified with the U.S. So they think, yeah, yes, okay, yes, democracy, the U.S. What else? No, it's not human anymore. No, the democracy is very caught in Mexico and in Brazil and in Bolivia, everywhere. It's not a value that Latin Americans admire, democracy. It's hard to say, but it's real. But if you talk about families, if you talk about the migration, or if you talk about uh, those human experiences, you can find a tie. And I think both the border experience, because not we don't have only problems in the Mexican border with the US. They have it in Panama and Venezuela. It's very tragic, or in some other places in Peru. And they had it in China and Argentina. They had wars. When you talk about the border and migration, you are empathetic and you are close, and you are talking about families. So you can begin a discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have other questions? As you're thinking, I will also add yet one question. We were not talking that much about the domestic politics in the Latin American country. And the last decade saw two diverse trends. On the one hand, there is more nationalistic governments coming in the different countries.
Mhm.
Of the not yet, let's say. But other countries are still with a very strong left or even radical left governments. For your opinion, the next 5 years, will we have more of the left ideas dominant in Latin American countries? Or those of the populist type closer to the Argentinian, for example, government, and that would be the main new trend for the Latin America?
Well, what I can see, well, the trend was or is still is polarization. Uh, and we experienced that in Mexico. You see that in Brazil, you see that in Argentina, almost everywhere. Chile was an example of civilized polarization. They were very urban in the discussion, but now it's also a more aggressive polarization like in the rest of the countries, like we have in Mexico. They don't have that in Colombia, they have it now. Venezuela is also a big, tremendous example of polarization. You see also now that in many Central American countries, but the new trend, I hope, will be something different. I hope it could be, let's say, a sense of unity. We don't have it yet, but I think we're still on the peak of polarization.
And probably the last question that is all around, the elephant in the room. You showed it in the very beginning, just the change from the US to China in some of the issues. But definitely the question of the United States and their changing role in Latin America is something what we see from Europe, at least, with the current administration. So we see absolutely different approaches to the country. Do you think it is temporarily, or it is the beginning of the total exit of the US as the strong power and the authority, let's say moral authority for many countries? That it's not only economically that China will take, but also because of the Trump behavior, especially regards Mexico as for now. We will see that Washington will lose their position and not only respect but influence in politics of the Latin America.
Yes, no, you're right. Yeah, for me it was very strange the first time that I was in Europe, that China was very present because in Mexico it's not. And then when I came back to Europe again as a diplomat, the second relevant delegation, diplomatic relation, are always the Chinese. And when you are living, for example, in the US, you don't notice any Chinese. You don't notice any Chinese government. You don't notice nothing, no? And it's like that in Mexico. It's like we were in a bubble. But well, in Brazil, you see it now really clear. You think that you are that the neighbor is not Argentina, that the neighbor is China. You don't see Volkswagen cars in Brasilia, only the old ones. Most of the new cars in Brasilia are Chinese. Impressive, impressive. Because Brazil used to be the proud of the German automotive industry, like, and sometimes Mexico, no? Yeah, and it's not anymore. No, I think the Chinese are already there in two big countries like Argentina and Brazil, but in many also smaller economies are very present. Now, what I think, which is something what works for China in Latin America and also in Canada is that the Chinese are not very ideological. They don't promote any ideology or any political activities that are very evident, no? So and this lack of ideology is welcome in Latin America, and as is welcome in Canada. Now the problem with Canada now is also that China is very present in Canada. You go to Vancouver, which used to be, as I mentioned once, Mexican, and it's very Chinese. And the Pacific coast of Canada is very, very Chinese. On the high level, high level. You're not talking about that of migrants that are coming now. No, it's high level Chinese economic elite. No, so and now you see a United States which is let's say a bit ambushed. No, in the north they are very present in Canada. In the south, they are very present in Latin America. Not yet in Mexico, but now Panama, but used to be an American bastion. It's very Chinese, Panama, no? So the United States is trying to escape of this, let's say, new dynamics, not only in the world but also in the main local regional sphere. No? Yeah, what the I'm thinking now in German. What the Germans say or mention as Lebensraum, no? Your vital space. Now the vital space of the US is smaller, and it's becoming more Chinese, no?
Mhm.
So I think that's like in polarization is the reality now. I don't know what's going to happen next, but I think that's why the US is trying to have new partners, for example, Russia, and trying to have more influence in regions where the U.S. lost influence. But the problem is that they are using the wrong methods. No, they are using the force. They are using the pressure, no, political pressure, force. So I don't think they have already a new recipe to achieve this loss of hegemony. But they really notice. No, you can see it.
Thank you very much. We will be finishing it for today. As we promised, thank you for being with us on Friday morning. It's really too early in Mexico, but I hope that it is just the beginning, that we managed today at least to bring some general perspective of this huge region that some of our participants been working with. And that we will be able to have you as the contact a person in case somebody will have the continuing interest in this region, as the Ukrainian Prism is developing its Latin American program as well. So the last visit to Mexico of the Ukrainian Prism was just the beginning. We hope that we will have other opportunities for the at least online events, but definitely hope for the offline events. And for our participants, next week we're moving again to Asia. To China, Taiwan, and that part of the world. And that will be really interesting to make this bridge from the increased Chinese role in Latin America that Horacio described today to what is happening in the immediate neighborhood and in China itself. So Wednesday, Friday was just the exclusion this time. My big appreciation to Horacio, our round of applause to him from the participants. Thank you very much, and see you soon.